Hello, and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today, our guest is Christina Parandii. She is a fellow at German Marshall Fund, and her research focus is on the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you, Sergey. Nice to see you here.
Tell us, what is the current stance of the EU accession of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia? Lately, there have been a report published by the EU regarding how much progress these countries have achieved.
Indeed, last week was quite significant in terms of some developments for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, to a less extent in terms of their progress towards the opening of accession for Ukraine and Moldova in the first case, and towards perhaps granting of candidacy status to Georgia. So these countries are on two different tracks, and we can come to that point a bit later. But basically, what I have just mentioned was the interim assessment by the European Commission on the steps which the European Commission recommended to the countries last year, along with its historic decision on candidate status for Ukraine and Moldova, and on recognizing Georgia as potential candidate. And basically, this was a very interesting development because that's the first time in the Commission's history when it gives the oral update. So basically, that's the new format of taking stock of progress of these countries, because the regular format of assessment is on the yearly basis, and that's going to happen in October later this year, when Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia will be added to the broader list of countries which now fall under the enlargement policy of the EU. And that is something when the European Commission has the opportunity to present its comprehensive vision of how the policy is going forward, and to present really comprehensive written overview. This time it was different, so it was mostly informal. It was given by the Commissioner for the Enlargement in the firm first as a report to the EU institutions, to COREPER, that's the body of permanent representatives of member states to the EU, and also to the ministers, and then it was handed over to the three countries. So that was a really new format, and the purpose of it was just to take stock of progress to see if these three targets are meeting the goals, if they are meeting the benchmarks set up by the EU, the closer they move to this historic October communication, which we expect to be really comprehensive and really in-depth. And just to place this in the broader context, why it's really important right now, because this year we may expect some developments about the opening of accession talks with Ukraine and Moldova. That's not a given yet, but it's highly probable. So the idea was to flag some of the concerns that EU has towards these two countries, so that they have some time to resolve them before this formal decision can come into play. So that's just the general context, but perhaps we can take it from here.
Exactly. You have already mentioned a lot of topics, which I would love to dig deeper. First, what are the concerns?
Well, I think here we really need to basically provide the overview of what are things which the EU is more happy with before we dig into the concerns, because basically for these three countries, we had different sets of criteria. So for instance, for Ukraine last year, along with the decision to grant Ukraine a candidate status, there were 7 major steps which the EU wanted to have completed before Ukraine can open its accession negotiations. For Moldova, that was 9 benchmarks, and for Georgia, 12. And of course, all of these benchmarks and steps, they are very country specific. So there are no really broad concerns which unite all of them. Although, of course, some policy areas like anti-corruption or judiciary or other fundamental democracy-related areas, of course, they can overlap. But still, we need to understand that this is very country-specific approach. And if we start with Ukraine, for instance, we saw that out of the 7 steps which the EU wanted Ukraine to progress on within the year since the last year's decision on candidacy status, 2 steps were fully completed. So that's kind of a really good progress demonstrated by Ukraine, and we can
May I interrupt you here? When you say fully completed, this doesn't mean that Ukraine doesn't need to do anything on this field to be an EU member. It means that Ukraine doesn't need anything to get like some sort to the next step of the negotiations, right?
Definitely. So now we're talking only about this pathway to the opening of negotiations. So we are not even talking about membership yet, because basically as the enlargement policy works, right now we are at the stage when we have candidacy status. That's very good because of the formal exchanges which all the candidate countries have with the Commission and the more intense work towards preparing them for opening of the accession talks. But then when we talk about the opening of the accession talks, basically that means the whole new area of work which needs to be done. And that's largely about the full-fledged synchronization of the legislation of each particular country with EU acquis, and also about the broader developments. So right now we're discussing really this preliminary phase before we can count an opening. Because for Ukraine and also for Moldova, opening would be a really historic decision for this year. So that's where all of the attention of these countries should go. Because also, if we consider the context that next year we will have the European Parliament elections and the formation of new Commission, probably this can be a very last chance to get this approval of the start of negotiations to proceed. So what will happen afterwards would be probably a subject of yet another discussion. But right now we are focusing only on these preliminary steps, and that's basically the list where you need just to tick boxes and implement very precise steps in different areas to progress towards this opening.
So these tick boxes are the rule of law, anti-corruption, and other areas. Could you tell us, like, what are what is the situation on every single field?
Yeah. Shall we start with Ukraine then, or?
Yes.
Okay, because as I mentioned, these are country specific. So if we start with Ukraine, so we had 7 major areas, and as I mentioned, 2 were marked as areas with progress, and that involves the reform of the judiciary bodies, like the High Council of Justice and the High Qualification Commission of Judges. So here we see that these 2 judicial bodies are up and running, and basically we don't need to do anything extra on that front by the end of the year. So that's done. And the second area where Ukraine has demonstrated a good progress is the media reform. So we had the law adopted in the end of last year, which is compliant with the EU legislation on media. So those 2 areas are just already completely finished from Ukraine's side as the homework. And then we have 5 more areas. And here it's also important to underscore that the fact that they were not completed yet, it doesn't mean that there is no progress, because as it was mentioned in the presentation by the European Commission, that both Ukraine and Moldova demonstrated significant progress. So we are not talking about like 0 levels, there were different gradation. And in general, Ukraine received the mark as good progress on the area of the reform of the Constitutional Court. There are still some concrete steps which needs to be done, but they are minor compared to the work which already has been achieved. And then 4 more areas with some progress. So this some progress, good progress, those are official terms used by the Commission just to rank how far we are from achieving of the goals. And in these 4 areas of some progress, we have anti-corruption, and there is a set of measures which needs to be developed there, but that's the broader area. We have anti-money laundering area, we have de-oligarchization, and we have national minorities. So with these areas where some progress was made, it means that there is still a lot of work to be done, either in the form of legislative amendments to the existing legislation, or in the form of development of new mechanisms. So it's still something which Ukraine will need to concentrate on for the next couple of months before the Commission's update in October.
Can you bring like any example of what exactly should be done on the area with some progress, for example, money laundering or minorities?
Yeah, no, so in these 4 areas where some progress was done, we see some where it's very clear what exactly is expected from Ukraine, and basically it's quite easy to implement. For instance, if we talk about anti-corruption, one of the key requirements is to return the e-declaration system. So the system when the public officials of Ukraine declare their assets in a transparent electronic mechanism. That system was really crucial when Ukraine was negotiating its visa-free regime back a couple of years ago, but it was suspended for the period of the war. And for many partners of Ukraine, including the EU, that's a big concern, because that was really one of the pioneering initiatives to demonstrate that Ukraine is progressing. So now the requirement is to get the system back on track. So Ukraine already knows how to do it. Ukraine already has the system. It's just to really put the decision into place and continue doing that. So that's just one of the examples. Another example in the anti-corruption area is that Ukraine needs to demonstrate some track record with convictions. So basically to take forward some of the high-profile cases. So again, that's not something which we don't know how it works. It's fairly straightforward. So that's quite clear. And then, for instance, you mentioned the area of national minorities. And this is basically the most problematic point of the whole list of recommendations, because, of course, there were some political concerns from the side of Hungary specifically about the status of Hungarian minority before. And that's why this issue was really highlighted since 2022, when the candidate status was granted. But now Ukraine also received the recommendation of the Venice Commission, and that's basically the body which is responsible for checking whether the country's legislation is compliant with constitution, but also a wide range of other norms, international norms, human rights. And that was something which actually went beyond what even expert community in Ukraine was expecting, because apart from clarifying the status of minorities like Hungarian or the status of educational minority in schools, the Venice Commission now decided that, for instance, the status of Russian language should be really protected more than Ukraine can do in the situation of the full-scale war. So, for instance, that is something where Ukraine really needs to look into what is realistic out of this recommendation, but which points are really not fit for purpose in the situation that we have in Ukraine right now. So, for instance, that is the area where really a lot of thinking should be done. Also, a lot of negotiations with the European side, perhaps to kind of revisit some of the norms which were recommended by the Venice Commission, and then to agree on a more precise steps. So indeed, a wide area of issues which can be tackled, but at the same time, some of them which still require clarification from the side of the European Union.
Indeed, that is exactly these discussions between Ukraine and the EU Commission, what should be done with the wartime, what should not be done with the wartime, should be addressed in e-declarations of the public servants, judges, or politicians should be published or not out of security concerns, or how much is it reasonable to guarantee special rights for the Russian language or Russian language education when Russia still uses Russian language as the weapon of war. That are all the questions which should be taken into consideration, of course. But I want to go further and ask you about another country which has also its aspiration to be an EU member, and it is Moldova. But before we go to Moldova, don't forget to share, to like, to subscribe to this channel. And if you have questions or comments, please leave them in the commentary section. My question about Moldova is, there were in Ukraine some concerns, not some concerns, but some commenters that Ukraine will be a EU member and will invest a lot of time and passion into this, in reforms, because it's a big country and is always in focus of attention. But Moldova can join the EU just because it's a neighbor of Ukraine, and you cannot have a non-EU country between two EU countries. I think it is like a bit of simplification. So what is about the progress of Moldova described in this report?
Basically, the progress outlined by the Commission in relation to Moldova quite echoes the patterns we see in Ukraine, that there is some steady progress made. And actually, the European Commission assessed both Ukraine and Moldova as countries with a good track record. That's another bureaucratic slang of the European Commission to indicate that actually we can really look into the options of opening accession in December this year. So both countries are grouped, not formally, but at least according to the assessments, as the countries which are fulfilling the obligations for the time being. It's not overwhelming as of yet, because in the case of Moldova, out of 9 steps, 3 were completed. So that's a very good progress. And then then Moldova had some progress on just 3. And then the remaining 3 were with good progress. So we see that there is movement. There was absolutely no area where there was 0 progress made. So that just testifies to us that for the time being, Moldova is viewed as a credible player in this process of European integration. And in general, we also see some political dimension, because that's something I wanted to mention about both Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, that, of course, we have some formal evaluations done by the Commission, and we have all of these formal benchmarks and criteria. But we also have another part which is more of contextual nature, which is more of the political nature, and this is how these countries are viewed in general. So Moldova and Ukraine are viewed positively. That's a good signal to Moldova for sure. As you mentioned before, there were these speculations that, well, maybe Moldova will just jump on the back of Ukraine and just try to make some progress, not as the country which wants to do it and does it independently, but because the opportunities arise. At the same time, we see really good progress from the sign of the Moldova's government. So we really see the committed pro-European government. And there was a recent summit of the European political community just a couple of weeks ago, and we also saw that that sent a message that Moldova really wants to be a member of the European Union and that Moldova belongs to the European family. And given that Moldova has good relations with some of the major European countries, which now are in the driving seat for the European enlargement process, notably France, there are really good relations between Maia Sandu, the president of Moldova, with President Macron of France. We just see that it's kind of the objective assessment coupled with political perception of Moldova as a country which is capable of making progress that can make it absolutely realistic for Moldova to be ranked on the same level as Ukraine.
And what about Georgia? Like, Georgia received like the same invitation to join the process as Ukraine and Moldova, but obviously the development there is not like as fast as in Moldova and in Ukraine currently.
Sure, and the problem is that the direction of developments in Georgia is also probably not going in the same line as Ukraine's and Moldova's. So here again, we have two aspects: the institutional changes, which are lagging behind, and that is something we saw from the European Commission oral update on Georgia. So we saw that there are some problems with the core fundamental democratic institutions. We saw absolutely zero progress with media freedom. So of course, those were kind of the red flags for the EU. And although there was some progress made in some other areas, the tone of voice of the European Commission in the presentation of these reports definitely differed for Georgia if we compare it to Ukraine and Moldova. And of course, there is the broader political process that for Georgia, the political polarization in the country is quite high. We see public moods which are largely in line with European integration and breaking off ties with Russia. At the same time, we see the government with its policies, sometimes repressive policies, sometimes really like strange from Ukrainian perspective in terms of their relations with Russia. So both in the institutional dimension and the political direction of the country, it gives us all the grounds to believe that probably there will be no good decision for Georgia this year as to the recognition of it as the candidate country. So we can expect that Georgia will just remain the potential candidate as it was recognized last year.
So based on what you have described before, what are the next steps? Like, what is the next timeline? Because like every report regarding Ukraine is being cheered as a groundbreaking historical decision last year to offer Ukraine this path to enter the EU. And this year we are in the middle of the step one with like starting of the negotiations. And still you say that it is already the next historic step. Like, how much historic steps should Ukraine, Moldova, and other countries take on their path to the EU?
I mean, 2 more to go. So the first one, the candidacy status, for sure, that was a historic decision. And just for 2 main reasons. First, for geopolitical reason, that finally EU stopped to see this buffer zone between its borders and Russia as the no-go countries for enlargement. That was really a historic decision. So I can't really overemphasize it, because we know that for decades, EU had these 2 different policy baskets. And one was designated to Western Balkan countries and also Turkey, and those countries were considered as potential members. But when we talked about the Eastern Europe, we had a different institutional configuration. We had the Eastern Partnership Policy, which actually that was the official line, that it's kind of the alternative to enlargement. It was really Georgia to be in this no candidate basket, but the fact that EU decided to merge the two, it was really big in terms of the political thinking. So both from the geopolitical consideration perspective, but also how, like in terms of how this policy will be executed. Because if we talk about the EU, of course, that's the big player, and for each policy, it has also sets of distinct instruments, financial instruments, collaboration instruments, whatever you call them. So that was really big. But why we are talking about another historic decision is about the opening of accession. That's for sure, because that would be really fast compared to the experience of most of the other countries. If Ukraine and Moldova manages to start accession negotiations, that would be basically less than 2 years since the granting of candidacy status to them. And if we compare that with the experience of Western Balkan countries, that's really basically the sprint which they made. So that will be really important, because as we discuss these boxes to be ticked when we discuss the benchmarks, those are basically like one-time steps. Of course, they have broad implications, but this is still not the comprehensive reform which makes the country fully in line with what the EU expects. But this chapter starts only after opening of negotiations. So this is a lengthy process, comprehensive one, when basically each area of the country's legislation is being scrutinized. And that's why we are talking about the importance of this decision. And of course, the third one will be the actual membership. But that's, of course, something which is quite far in terms of the planning. So probably we shall not dwell so much on that now. We shall concentrate on the second big step.
But when can the second big step be taken, this candidate status?
The opening of negotiations.
Yeah, oh, yes, sorry, yes, of course, opening of negotiations.
Well, if everything goes well, and if the countries, if Ukraine and Moldova follow up on this oral update and recommendations, we can expect December to be a month where the decision on opening of accession negotiation can start. So that is the optimistic scenario, but also perhaps a realistic one.
So in this case, the opening of negotiations will take, like, from the candidate status to opening of negotiations, it will like pass less than 2 years. And you have already mentioned the history of the Western Balkans, when the same process is still ongoing, and like for some countries, it takes like years and years and years. Doesn't it create some sort of conflicts, internal like competition, and feelings that, the EU doesn't want to see us really, we are not as privileged as the other countries?
That was a big discussion last year, and that was also the source of apprehension among member states, EU member states, which feared that granting Ukraine and Moldova candidate status will offend Western Balkan countries, with some of them being, as you mentioned, in line for membership for 20 years, like in the case of North Macedonia, which, by the way, had to change its name just because of the demands of some of the member states. So basically Greece, and now it has some issues with Bulgaria. So just to map that, indeed, some of the Western Balkan countries experience unpleasant developments when it came to their own consideration as candidate countries, and then as countries with the negotiations ongoing. At the same time, in general, the decision on Ukraine and Moldova last year was actually positive for Western Balkan countries. And the reason for that is, before 2022, we just saw that enlargement process has stalled. There was almost nothing going on. There were lots of mutual concerns from the EU side, from Western Balkan countries side, and we didn't see any progress. So that was basically just nothing which we could expect to develop from that situation. And now, when we have really enthusiastic countries like Ukraine and Moldova, that actually creates the sense of positive competition. So, of course, competition will be there, but what is important that the rules for this competition are merit-based. And by merit-based, I mean that the countries are assessed objectively. They are not assessed based on their regional location. They are not assessed based on some other considerations. Of course, in case in Ukraine, it would be the moral dimension of country fighting the war. And then, of course, we need to consider that. But merit-based approach means that all the countries are assessed based on their individual performance, based on the reforms they undertake. And in this regard, for Western Balkan countries, that's also the chance to start moving faster, so that their progress is assessed also at the same level as Ukraine's and Moldova's. And if you have this unification of what you expect from the countries in place, then of course it will be not really wise from the candidate countries' perspective to object to it, because then it clearly means that if you want to play in this game, you really need to follow the rules. So basically, of course, there are some emotional reactions. At the same time, in terms of concrete opportunities, Western Balkan countries now have much more than they used to have before 2022, before Ukraine and Moldova were also added to this candidate country list.
But will this argumentation be accepted by the societies in the Western Balkans? Like what you say is absolutely logical, and you clearly point out the profits of this process. But there is also an emotional, like moral side when people say, okay, like we're staying in front of the closed doors for so many years. Do we need it?
Yeah, but I think there are two dimensions, right? The one is about the justice element, if you compare Western Balkans with Ukraine and Moldova. And on that point, we already saw some really positive developments from the side of the leaders of certain Western Balkan countries, particularly Albania, North Macedonia, also Montenegro. And these are the countries which have the closest political relationship with the EU. So we see them as really like countries which have ambitions and which still have the will to go forward. And these countries openly supported Ukraine, for instance. So we remember that before the before the decision of the Commission and the European Council to grant Ukraine the candidate status, the leaders of these countries arrived to Kiev, and they stood side by side with President Zelensky, and they openly voiced support for Ukraine to be added to this list. So another illustration was, again, this European Political Community Summit, where we saw really good collaboration happening between Ukraine, Moldova, and these three Western Balkan countries. So I think this sends us the signal that if the leadership of these countries send the right message to the populations about the opportunities, also about the fact that, okay, now we are a bigger group, so perhaps we also need to do something extra to be considered as front runners, for instance, or to move forward, that can be perceived well. But of course, another dimension, which is more global one, is what you mentioned about the very general concept of, is it worth to keep banging on the door of the EU if we have been doing so for years and there was no result? And here, unfortunately, we have this emotional element of perception, and that's understandable. At the same time, it's also the question, what's the alternative? Because frankly, even if we look at the region of Western Balkan countries, there is definitely no alternative. There are some countries which tend to lean towards Russia, like Serbia. We see the Russian trace there quite clearly. We see also Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is quite dysfunctional because of the impact of Republika Srpska, which is also Russia-supported entity within the country. And of course, for them, the question of membership is not such an ideational, it's not the conceptual aspiration. They are not really very much into the EU as the political concept. But for the other societies, like in the countries I mentioned, we definitely see that there is this attachment that we want to be part of the European family. And also we see some very precise considerations of economy, of investments, of the freedom of mobility, and so on and so forth. And basically, although the process is not really the most smooth one, there is no alternative what else you can do. So probably it's better to concentrate on the homework and just to do whatever it takes to use the political momentum. Because right now we clearly have the political momentum both for Ukraine and Moldova and for the Western Balkan countries. So it will be just wise to use that from the side of all of these aspirant countries.
If we talk about the Western Balkans, you have mentioned that different countries have a different situation, and we clearly have a huge problem with Russian influence in certain countries, and we clearly don't want to have like Russia dominated and Russia influenced EU members, and I don't believe that they want to be under the supervision or to develop in harmony with the EU rules, because they have their own view how they want to create their society. But if we talk in general about the region, what are the perspectives there, and what are the biggest problematic fields which need to be addressed?
Some of the areas are really similar to the problems we have also in Eastern Europe. So that's, of course, the question of the rule of law, of anti-corruption, tackling organized crime, and things along these lines. It really depends on the country. Again, if we follow the country-based approach, this makes much more just consideration of how countries are progressing. We also see a more systemic problem of political instability and also frequent changes of governments in some of the countries. That was the case for Montenegro, and basically the polarization of which is happening in the societies. There's also the nationalistic element, because we know that for this particular region, there are various ethnic groups, sometimes within the borders of each and every country, and it makes it difficult to make the coherent political agenda for the country as such to move forward. So the issues are numerous. Unfortunately, we also have some issues which are imposed from outside. And here, of course, one dimension is the influence of Russia. At the same time, we also have some domestic problems connected to some demands of the EU member states. As I mentioned, with the case of North Macedonia, the fact that the country really needs to go through these difficult political processes without getting immediate rewards, of course, it makes the population very unhappy, and of course, it contributes to political instability. So there are some objective reforms which are expected from these countries, especially in the area of anti-corruption. And based on that, that would also be the question for the EU, if these countries receive the necessary progress which was expected, if they reach the necessary progress which was expected from them, if the EU member states are willing to drop some of the politically motivated decisions. So that was probably something which was the issue for Western Balkan countries for years, something I call the vicious circle, that you have objective problems on the part of domestic societies and domestic political situations. And the second element of this vicious circle is having the biased attitudes from the side of the EU. And of course, one exacerbates another. So it's basically the question, if these countries take the opportunity to deliver on objective reforms, if the EU will be able to reform its own approach, its own institutions and policies, just to drop these biased attitudes and just to go forward with the objective results the countries deliver. But there should be a political will first. And again, understanding that the opportunities are ripe right now, probably we won't see that happening any time soon after the elections of the European Parliament, when there will be a focus on something else. So it would be really good to see some movement from both regions in terms of concrete deliverables by October of this year, when the Commission will present its overview in the enlargement package communication.
But is the EU ready to get that many, like in the next years, maybe decade, so many new members that will bring like significant changes into the balance of the powers in the EU?
Right now, it's not. And that's another objective issue on the part of enlargement process, that absorption capacity of the EU is not yet there to absorb so many new members. And actually here, the biggest issue is Ukraine, for sure, because of the other countries' size. It's not the big problem of, for instance, financial adjustments, but of course, it's still the issue for the governance structure of the EU. But when we speak about Ukraine, that's of course a whole game changer because of the size of the country, the size of the population, also the structure of the economy. For instance, for the EU, the agricultural policy is one of the crucial ones. And from what we saw already with the protest of the farmers in the Eastern and Central European countries bordering Ukraine, when they didn't want Ukrainian grain to be sold on EU markets because of the price difference. Of course, this is already something which indicates that in the current shape of the EU, it's not ready to absorb new members. So that's, of course, something that EU needs to work on from its side in parallel to what the candidate countries, and by candidate, I mean basically all the countries aspiring to join the EU. So just not to dive into technicalities of this term. So we understand that this should be a parallel process of the aspirant countries trying to deliver on their reforms. At the same time, EU needs to address the absorption capacity issue. On this question, we already have some developments. So we have the Franco-German working group dedicated to the internal EU reform question, We expect some reports by this working group also by the end of the year with some concrete proposals how EU will need to adjust to be able to absorb these countries. We also saw that Belgium, which will soon take over the EU presidency from next year, it's also trying to prepare how it can insert these issues to the political agenda for 2024. And we see some movement, we see some political willingness on the EU side and on the side of the big EU member states to move forward this process, like France and Germany, as I mentioned before. But of course, we really need to get the consensus from all the countries. That can be difficult because that can also mean that some of the countries which are now net beneficiaries of EU budgets may become net contributors. So perhaps they will get less support, less structural funds, because the structural funds will need to be deployed elsewhere for poorer members of the Union in case of all the Western Balkan and Eastern European states which want to join. At the same time, we see the movement. So that's the promising sign, but we'll still need to know what's in the proposal which is being prepared for the EU reform topic.
Well, this is incredibly interesting, but I'm afraid this is a topic for another half an hour interview. The political processes, they take time and sometimes they look boring and hard to be understood, but they're inevitable. And at the end, we have the result. And the result for Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, for the Western Balkan countries will be sooner or later the membership in the EU, what we all hope. Today, the difficulties and the steps on this way were explained to us by Christina Parandii. She is a fellow at the German Marshall Foundation. Thank you so much, Christina, for your stunning interview. And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to our channel. And if you have still questions, write them into the commentary section and wait for our new interviews.
Thanks for having me.